30 years ago, an entire class of black students disappeared during a school field trip. The investigation stalled and the case was closed, leaving the families without answers. But one mother never gave up. While revisiting old photos, she noticed a detail that no one had ever noticed before. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. 30 years ago, the town of Millhaven was an unassuming place nestled in the heart of the American South. It was the kind of town where everyone knew their neighbors, where the seasons passed with a quiet rhythm, and where the streets held echoes of Sunday sermons and children's laughter. But beneath its calm facade, Millhaven bore a wound that had never fully healed, a wound inflicted by a tragedy that many had tried to forget. In the fall of 1993, a class of 18 African American children from Millhaven Elementary School disappeared without a trace. The children, ranging in age from 9 to 11, had been on a school trip to Lakewood National Park, a sprawling expanse of woodland and trails about 2 hours away. It was meant to be a day of fresh air and nature walks, of laughter and learning. The children had boarded a bright yellow school bus that morning, waving to their parents, their faces alight with the joy of a day out of the classroom. But that bus, along with every soul on it, never returned. Accompanying the children was their teacher, Mrs. Harriet Harris, a dedicated educator in her early 30s. She was well liked by students and parents alike, known for her patience and genuine care. She had planned the trip meticulously, filling permission slips, coordinating with park staff, and ensuring that everything was in order. Joining her were 2 adults, the bus driver, a man named Jack Turner, and the school's assistant principal, Martin Frazier. At least, that was what the records indicated. When the bus failed to return by evening, the first ripples of worry turned into waves of panic. Parents called the school, then each other, and finally the police. A search party was organized that night, and by morning, the quiet town of Millhaven was a hive of frantic activity. Dozens of volunteers, police officers, and even the local fire department scoured the roads and forested areas between the school and the park. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights cutting through the morning mist. Dogs were brought in, their noses low to the ground, but there was no scent trail to follow. It was as if the bus and its occupants had simply evaporated into thin air. The investigation that followed was swift, but, in hindsight, deeply flawed. The local police, unaccustomed to handling such a case, were quick to form a narrative. Mrs. Harris, the teacher, became the focus of their investigation. Whispers spread through town, stories of how she had struggled financially, how her marriage had been rocky, how perhaps she had orchestrated the disappearance to escape her own life. The media echoed these suspicions, and soon Mrs. Harris's face was plastered on every local news channel as a person of interest. But there was no evidence. No ransom note, no sightings, no credible leads. The bus was never found, and despite extensive searches, not a single piece of clothing or a backpack turned up. Over time, the investigation stalled. The FBI got involved, but eventually withdrew, citing a lack of evidence to pursue the case further. What began as a desperate search for missing children slowly dissolved into a cold case, filed away in a dusty cabinet in the back room of the Millhaven Police Department. Throughout it all, one voice remained consistent: Principal Edward Green, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a steady gaze. He had been principal of Millhaven Elementary for over a decade, a respected figure in the community. He held press conferences offering condolences to the grieving families and vowing to cooperate fully with the investigation. His voice was calm, his words carefully measured. He urged the town to pray, to support each other, and, in time, to heal. His own alibi was airtight. He had been homesick on the day of the trip, confirmed by a neighbor who had brought him soup. As the years passed, the town of Millhaven began to cover its scar with the layers of new memories. The empty seats in classrooms were filled by new students. The parents of the missing children either moved away or found quiet ways to cope. The memorial stone erected in the town square became a place where the names of the children were etched in stone, a silent reminder that life goes on, even when the truth remains buried. But not everyone moved on. Linda Matthews, mother of 9-year-old Tanya, was among the few who refused to let go. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, she stood before the memorial stone, her hands trembling as she traced the carved letters of her daughter's name. She had become a quiet figure of mourning in Millhaven, a woman who had transformed her home into a shrine of memories. Photographs of Tanya lined the walls, her first day of school, her favorite dress, a lock of her hair saved from her last haircut. Her life had become a mosaic of moments, each a reminder of what had been stolen from her. Linda's husband had left 2 years after the disappearance, unable to bear the weight of the loss. Friends stopped visiting. The casseroles and sympathy cards that once filled her kitchen dwindled until only silence remained. But Linda did not break. She clung to hope with the ferocity of a drowning woman grasping for air. She wrote letters to the police, to state officials, to journalists, anyone who might listen. She studied every piece of information about that day, looking for the missing puzzle piece that might make sense of it all. And so, as the 30th anniversary of the tragedy approached, Linda found herself once again at the memorial stone, her hands weathered and her eyes sharp. She was not just a grieving mother. She was a detective, a historian, a woman with a mission. And though the town had grown weary of her questions, though her persistence had become a quiet legend, she was not deterred. She knew, deep down, that the story of what happened to the children of Millhaven was not over. The truth was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And she was determined to find it, no matter how deep she had to dig or how dark the truth might be. With the first chapter of this story closed but not forgotten, a new chapter was about to begin. One filled with secrets, with revelations, and with the undeniable pull of justice long delayed. The sky over Millhaven was overcast as Linda Matthews walked home from the cemetery, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her jacket. The air was thick with the weight of the past, pressing against her like a silent force. The memorial stone had been freshly cleaned, the carved names gleaming under the dull gray light, but it did little to soothe the ache in her chest. 30 years. 3 decades of silence, of unanswered questions, of watching time swallow her daughter's name like a river eroding stone. She needed answers. Back home, she moved with purpose, heading straight for the spare bedroom that had become her personal archive. The walls were lined with shelves, each packed with boxes labeled with names and dates. Newspaper clippings, old police reports, transcripts of interviews, everything she had collected over the years lay within these walls. Most people had long accepted the official story, but Linda had never stopped looking. There was something wrong with the way the case had been handled. She had always felt it, an unease that gnawed at the edges of her mind. Pulling out an old album, she flipped through the pages filled with photographs of Tanya and her classmates. The pictures were a time capsule of childhood, grinning faces, awkward poses, moments frozen before everything changed. Then she found it. The photograph had been taken the day before the field trip. The children stood outside the school, their smiles bright, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. The yellow school bus loomed in the background, and there, standing at the far right, was Edward Green. Linda's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the image, her pulse quickening. Green had always maintained that he had been sick that day. It was in the official records. The police had never questioned it. But here he was, standing beside the children, looking perfectly healthy. Why had he lied? The realization sent a shiver through her. If he had been at the school, then what else had he lied about? She dug deeper, pulling out old newspaper clippings and official statements. Green had played a major role in the aftermath of the disappearance. He had been the face of the school, the one who spoke to the media, the one who assured grieving families that everything possible was being done. He had been calm, composed, too composed in retrospect. Something didn't add up. Linda knew she needed to verify her suspicion. She picked up her phone and called the Millhaven Gazette, the local newspaper that had covered the case extensively. The receptionist who answered sounded young, likely someone who hadn't even been alive when the tragedy happened. "I need access to some old articles," Linda said. "From 1993, about the school trip that—" "Oh, you mean the disappearance?" The receptionist's voice softened slightly. "That's a really old case. Most of our archives from back then aren't digital, but we do have physical copies. I need anything with Edward Green's statements from that time. Press conferences, interviews, anything." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "We do have some records. You can come in and check them yourself. I'll be there in an hour." Hanging up, Linda grabbed her coat. She drove to the newspaper's headquarters, a small brick building that had stood for decades. Inside, she was led to the archives, where an older journalist, Martin Ellis, greeted her. He was one of the few people still around who had covered the disappearance. "I remember you," Ellis said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "You used to call every year, asking if we'd found anything new." "I still am," Linda said. Ellis studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come on, let's see what we can find." They spent the next hour combing through stacks of old newspapers. Linda scanned article after article, reading and rereading Green's statements. Then she found it. A quote from an interview he had given 2 days after the children vanished. "I was at home all day. The first I heard of the situation was when the police called me that evening." Linda clenched her jaw. He had lied. She sat back, staring at the words, the weight of them settling in her chest. Why would he lie about something so simple? Unless he had something to hide. Her hands trembled as she folded the newspaper, sliding it into her bag. As she drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. If Green had been at the school, then had he seen something? Or had he been involved? She needed more information. Arriving home, she went straight to her desk and pulled up the Millhaven Public Records website. She typed in Edward Green. His history was clean, too clean. No criminal record, no scandals, no financial troubles, at least none that were public. But then she searched for school records, and there it was. 2 years after the disappearance, Green had resigned as principal. He had claimed he was retiring early, but the records showed something unusual. He had received a large sum of money around the same time, a private inheritance. Linda's skin prickled. Who had given him that money? She scribbled down notes, her pulse hammering. She needed to talk to someone who had worked at the school during that time. someone who might remember details that were overlooked. She thought of Janet Cooper, the former school secretary. Janet had been working at Millhaven Elementary for years before the disappearance. If anyone knew the ins and outs of the school's operations back then, it was her. Linda found her number and dialed. The line rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Janet, it's Linda Matthews." A pause. "Linda, it's been a long time." "I know. Listen, I need to ask you something about Green." Silence. Then Janet sighed. "I was hoping never to talk about that again." "Please," Linda pressed. "It's important." "Did he ever mention anything unusual around the time of the disappearance? Or after?" There was another pause. Then Janet lowered her voice. "He left town fast, too fast, and he wasn't the same after that day. There was something off about him, like he was afraid of something, or someone." Linda's heart pounded. "Did he ever talk about the field trip?" "Not once," Janet said. "It was like he wanted to erase it from his memory." Linda gripped the phone. "Did he ever say where he got that money?" "I don't know, but I heard rumors that it wasn't an inheritance." "What do you mean?" Janet hesitated. "There were whispers that it was a payoff." Linda's breath caught. "A payoff for what?" "I don't know, Linda, but if I were you, I'd be careful. Some things in this town were meant to stay buried." The line went dead. Linda sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to her ear. Edward Green had been at the school the day before the trip. He had lied about his whereabouts. He had left town with a large sum of money that might not have been an inheritance. And now a former colleague hinted that it could have been a payoff. A sick feeling twisted in her gut. She had spent 30 years searching for the truth. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was getting close to it. The weight of the past pressed against Linda Matthews like an unbearable force as she sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, staring at the notes she had compiled over the last few days. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far more disturbing than she had anticipated. Edward Green had lied about his whereabouts the day before the disappearance. He had received a large sum of money 2 years later, and now, according to Janet Cooper, that money had likely been a payoff rather than an inheritance. But a payoff for what? The question gnawed at her, its implications dark and suffocating. If Green had been involved in the disappearance, then that meant the children hadn't simply vanished. They had been taken, sold, maybe, or worse. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine, but she pushed past it. She couldn't allow herself to break now, not when she was finally on the verge of something real. The next morning, she returned to the cemetery, not for the memorial, not for her own grief, but because something told her she needed to be there. She walked through the rows of graves, past the names of the missing children etched in stone. It was meant to be a symbolic resting place, a final acknowledgement of lives lost without closure. But closure was a lie. And then she saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the cemetery, her back to Linda, her posture rigid. She wasn't old, but there was something weathered about her, something that suggested she had seen things no one should ever have to see. She stood before one of the children's gravestones, her head bowed. Linda hesitated, then stepped forward. The woman turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. Her eyes met, and Linda's breath caught. The resemblance was uncanny. She had seen this face before, or at least a younger version of it. In the old school photos, in the class pictures that had been plastered across news reports 3 decades ago, this woman, whoever she was, looked exactly like one of the missing children. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she took another cautious step forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice measured but firm. The woman tensed. "I think I know who you are," Linda continued. The woman's eyes darted toward her, sharp and guarded. "You were in my daughter's class," Linda said softly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the woman exhaled, long and slow. "My name is Audrey Whitman," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda's knees nearly buckled. Audrey Whitman, one of the missing children, alive. Linda swallowed the lump in her throat. How is this possible?" Audrey hesitated, glancing around as if afraid they were being watched. "It's not safe to talk here," she murmured. "Come with me." Linda followed Audrey to a small cafe on the outskirts of town. They sat in a booth at the back, away from prying eyes. Linda's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee cup, watching Audrey with cautious anticipation. Audrey was quiet for a long time, staring into her untouched drink. Then, finally, she spoke. "The bus never went to the park," she said. Linda's breath caught. "That morning, when we left, everything seemed normal," Audrey continued. "Mrs. Harris was talking to us about the hike we'd be going on, but after about 20 minutes I realized we weren't going the right way. We weren't heading north toward the park. We were heading west toward the old industrial district." Linda's fingers tightened around the cup. "We didn't question it at first," Audrey said. "We were just kids. We thought maybe it was a different route. But then we stopped." Her voice wavered, and Linda could see the battle she was fighting to keep control of her emotions. There was another car waiting for us. 2 men got on the bus. One of them whispered something to the driver, then he got off. He just walked away, like he knew what was about to happen and didn't want to be part of it. Linda felt her stomach churn. The men made Mrs. Harris sit down. They told her if she made a sound, they'd hurt the children. I've never seen someone so terrified. Audrey's voice dropped to a whisper. Then they drove us somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Linda's grip on the table tightened. "We were locked in a warehouse for days," Audrey said. "They kept us separated. I don't know how many of us were still together. I only saw a few other kids. The rest—" Her voice cracked. "They started taking them away, one by one. We never saw them again." Linda felt bile rise in her throat. "I don't know where they took them," Audrey said, "but I know it was planned. Someone arranged it. Someone in town." Linda inhaled sharply. "Was it Green?" Audrey hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I saw him," she said. "Not that first night, but later. He came to the warehouse." Linda's vision blurred at the edges. "He wasn't alone," Audrey continued. "There were other men with him. I don't know what they said. I only remember the way he looked at us, like we weren't even human." Linda's body felt numb. "How did you get out?" she asked. Audrey exhaled shakily. "A mistake. A door left unlocked. I ran. I don't even know how I made it out of that place alive. But I did. And I never came back." Linda stared at her, the weight of the truth pressing down on her like a physical force. Edward Green hadn't just known what happened to the children. He had been part of it. And now, after 30 years of silence, the truth was finally coming to light. But there was one question left. "Do you know what happened to Tanya?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. Audrey lowered her eyes. Linda felt her heart shatter before the words even left Audrey's lips. "She didn't make it," Audrey whispered. She was one of the first they took." A sound escaped Linda's throat, a broken, fractured thing. She clutched her chest as if trying to hold herself together. The grief she had carried for 30 years swallowed her whole, but beneath it, beneath the agony, something else burned. Rage. Edward Green had stolen her child. And now he was going to pay. Linda Matthews had spent 30 years searching for the truth. Now that she had it, she realized that the pain of knowing was no easier than the pain of wondering. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, threatening to crush her beneath its weight. Tanya had been taken, stolen from her, and she had died long before Linda ever had a chance to save her. But grief would have to wait. Now was the time for justice. She sat in her car outside the police station, her fingers drumming restlessly against the steering wheel. Audrey Whitman sat beside her, silent and tense, her face pale as she stared out the window. Linda knew what this moment meant for her. For 3 decades, she had been living in the shadows, carrying the burden of a nightmare she had barely survived. And now, she was about to step into the light. "You don't have to do this," Linda said quietly. Audrey inhaled sharply, then turned to her. "Yes, I do." Linda gave a small nod. "Then let's go." The police station was sterile and cold, filled with the scent of coffee and paper. An officer at the front desk barely glanced up when they entered. Linda had been here before, many times over the years, pleading with different officers to reopen the case. She had memorized the way they looked at her. Pity, exhaustion, quiet frustration. This time was different. This time, she had proof. She stepped up to the desk, her voice steady. "I need to speak with Officer Jensen. It's about the Millhaven disappearance." That got the officer's attention. Minutes later, they were sitting in a small interrogation room. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the gray walls. Officer Jensen, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and graying hair, entered with a weary expression. "I hope this isn't another." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Audrey, his brows furrowed. "Who's this?" Linda leaned forward. "One of the missing children." Silence. For the first time in all her years of chasing the truth, Linda watched as a police officer looked genuinely stunned. Jensen slowly sat down, his hands folded on the table. "Start from the beginning," he said. Audrey took a deep breath. Then she began to talk. She told them everything. The bus taking the wrong route, the men who came for them, the warehouse where they were kept. She spoke in careful, measured tones, but Linda could hear the pain beneath every word. When she reached the part about Edward Green, Jensen's expression darkened. "You're telling me the former principal of Millhaven Elementary was involved in human trafficking?" he asked. Audrey nodded. "He came to the warehouse. I saw him." Jensen exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time, processing the weight of her words. Finally, he stood. "I need to make a call." Linda and Audrey sat in silence as Jensen left the room. Linda's fingers curled into fists on the table. It wasn't enough to know the truth. She needed to see something happen. The wait stretched, minutes crawling by with agonizing slowness. Then the door opened again. Jensen returned, his face unreadable. "We're reopening the case." Relief crashed over Linda like a wave. "We're bringing Green in for questioning," Jensen continued, "and we'll need Audrey to give a full statement." Audrey swallowed but nodded. Linda's heart pounded. "What about the other children?" she asked. "Can you track down what happened to them?" Jensen hesitated. "We'll try." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was something. By the time they left the station, the sky had darkened. Linda sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel as adrenaline still thrummed through her veins. Then, sirens. She turned her head just in time to see a convoy of police cars pulling out of the station, their lights flashing in the night. She didn't have to ask where they were going. They were going to Edward Green's house. Linda drove, following at a distance. She knew she shouldn't. This wasn't her fight anymore. But she had spent 30 years looking for this man, screaming into the void, and she needed to see it happen with her own eyes. Green's house was large, set back from the road, the kind of place a man could buy when he had more money than he should. The police surrounded it within minutes, officers moving in swift, controlled formation. Then the door opened. Edward Green stepped out onto his porch, looking much older than Linda remembered. His silver hair was thinner, his frame slightly stooped. But the moment he saw the officers, his eyes widened in something Linda could only describe as fear. The officers moved quickly, grabbing his arms, pinning them behind his back as they snapped handcuffs into place. Green shouted something, his voice rising in panic, but Linda couldn't hear it over the pounding of her own heart. It was over. For the first time in 30 years, it was over. Linda didn't realize she was crying until she felt the warm trail of tears down her face. She let out a shaky breath, gripping the wheel to steady herself. She had fought for this moment, and now that it was here, she felt empty. Justice was supposed to bring peace, but Tanya was still gone. Audrey still carried scars that would never fully heal, and the other children, so many of them, were still missing, still nameless victims of a crime that had been buried for too long. There was still work to do. In the days that followed, the town of Millhaven was turned upside down. The arrest of Edward Green made national headlines. Reporters swarmed the town, digging into his past, uncovering long-forgotten whispers about corruption and hidden dealings. Green was charged with multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping and trafficking. More arrests followed, people Linda had never even considered. Local businessmen, former law enforcement officers, men who had lived in Millhaven for decades, walking its streets like normal citizens. It was bigger than she had ever imagined. Linda sat through every court hearing, watching as the man who had stolen her daughter sat in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed to the table. He no longer looked powerful, no longer looked untouchable. And when the guilty verdict was finally read, Linda closed her eyes and exhaled. But justice was not the same as peace. In the months that followed, she continued to visit Tanya's memorial. She still traced the letters of her daughter's name with her fingers, still whispered quiet apologies for not being able to save her. Audrey, now under protection, started therapy. She spoke at a press conference, her voice shaking but steady as she told the world her story. Others came forward, families who had lost their children, people who had been too afraid to speak. The truth had finally come to light. But some wounds never truly heal. Linda knew that, but as she stood by her daughter's memorial one last time, she also knew this. Tanya's story had not been forgotten, and neither had her fight. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Check out other videos on the channel for more gripping stories. And if you think someone else should hear this, share this video with them. Thanks for watching.